I'm also walking in my car. They don't bite anybody. They start hurting.
Well, thank you. I hope you've enjoyed your day at Avon Hills, and we want to remind you to fill out your evaluation form and turn it in at the registration desk. So, and with no further ado, I'm sorry. Oh, here is Diane.
Thank you.
Yay.
Yay!
Thank you for joining me for the second session. We're going to talk about the 10 plants that changed Minnesota. I'm going to explain the project to you and then talk about each of the 10 plants. My name is Diane Narum. I'm a researcher in the Horticultural Science Department at the University of Minnesota. And I actually research native grasses and their relationship with butterflies and moths. But the reason I'm giving this presentation today is because I work with Mary Meyer. She's an extension horticulturalist and professor, and she's the one that spearheaded this project. And so I've been working with her for a year, doing teacher trainings across the state related to the 10 Plants project. And now this semester she's on sabbatical, so I'm filling in for her to give this presentation. To start the presentation off, I'm going to talk about the motivation for this project. And it was when Mary heard about this thing called plant blindness. So plant blindness is the term given to the lack of appreciation people have for plants, which also goes into just literally not being able to see and remember plants. So there were studies done, and people were shown pictures and videos such as this, and then they were taken away. And then people were asked, what was in that photo? And people could remember there was a baby deer, but they literally, some people cannot even remember seeing the ferns or the forest. And this is partially biological, so people are wired to notice and put more importance to other people and animals, but it's also societal and cultural. For example, this quote kind of exemplifies that. The average citizen can recognize 1,000 brand names and logos, but fewer than 10 local plants. Wow. Right, so if your society or your culture isn't emphasizing the importance of plants, then biology is just going to take over and you're not even going to notice them. Also, when people were studying this plant blindness, they found that if kids around, especially around middle school age, were engaged in plants and plant learning through a plant mentor, then they were more likely to care about plants later and eventually go into plant-related careers. So I don't know, if you guys can probably think of a plant mentor that you have. You're probably interested in plants if you're at this conference. You're probably not one of the people that have plant blindness. And so I know, like for me, it was both of my parents, but especially my dad, would take me for walks and point out plants, give them names, name the plants in front of me, and maybe even tell me like medicinal uses for them, or if I could eat them or not, if they were edible. And so this is really important to try to connect with kids, especially middle school and high school. That's when they start to really turn off of plants, but to connect with them and show them the importance of plants. And so the 10 plants that changed Minnesota, this project is in general a public campaign, but then we also targeted schools and teachers with this project. So there was many different components to the project, and I will go over the important ones, emphasize the important ones. It all started with a public campaign for nominations. So they went to the public and they asked, what plants do you think were important to Minnesota, had the most impact? And after they got that, there was a group of people that decided what the top 10 plants would be. And I'll go over that in detail in the next slide. But there was, along with the public nominations, there was all these different things that went along with it. There was a reading list at the Anderson Horticultural Library. There's a freshman seminar that Mary taught, a youth challenge, and it was the Ag in the Classroom theme for a year. A website was developed for this project, top10plantsmn.org. And then it culminated with the publication of the book. And so the book is basically the story of each plant throughout Minnesota history and some ancient history as well as thrown in there. And then why it was important to Minnesota, how interacts with Minnesota today, and it has information about environmental impact in there as well. The last part of the project was teaching these workshops throughout the state of Minnesota, and the teacher's activity handbook was published at the same time as the 10 Plants book. And so for the teacher workshops, we went throughout the state and we connected teachers with the book and with the handbook and taught them about the 10 plants. So back to the plants themselves. The public nominations gave us a lot of interesting options for the 10 plants. Some of them were to be expected: apple, wild rice, soybeans, sugar beets. Some of them were a little more unique: azaleas. Who doesn't love azaleas? Someone even nominated the cutie orange. Yeah, they must really like mandarin oranges. So then once all those nominations were collected, there was an expert panel that weighed each choice and considered the impact based on these 6 criteria. So the environmental impact the plant had on the state, the economic impact, cultural, spiritual impact historically, the sustenance value of the food, and then also the impact in the landscape. And so in the end, the 10 plants were chosen. They are wheat, corn, and soybeans, 1 forage crop, alfalfa, 2 food crops, apple and wild rice, 2 trees, white pine and American elm, and then 2 landscape plants, lawn and purple loosestrife. So these plants have probably affected all of us in some way, shape, or form. Does anyone want to share a story related to one of the 10 plants? Do you look at one of those plants and think in your head, oh yeah, does a memory come up, or any kind of story?
Smell of hay.
The smell of hay, yeah, that's a good one.
Oh God, just watching all the elms come down.
Yes, a lot of people talk about elms when I ask that question.
We lived I grew up on the remnants of an old farm, and we had the farmyard in like 10 acres. Yeah, and the whole front yard was elm trees.
Yeah.
And just like 2 summers in a row, just they came down because they were dead. Oh God, it was horrible.
Yeah, so we will talk about that, the Dutch Elm Disease. But I'm gonna go through the 10 plants in the order that I had them in that slide. And so we're gonna go through the crops first, the food plants, the trees, and then end with the landscape plants. So we're gonna start off with wheat, and wheat is very integral to the history of Minnesota, which I did not realize when I first started this project. And to show us how integral it is, we're gonna start off with a trivia question. So the Washburn A mill produced how much flour per day in 1890? Does anyone want to guess? 5? We got a 5?
5.
We go for 5, yeah.
Yeah, we'll go for
Little.
12 million.
12.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, it
nice.
seems like a crazy number. It does. This is an amazing amount of flour to be coming out of one mill in 1890. But Minnesota had the cool weather climate that was good for growing wheat, and had the rivers that were good for mills, powering mills, and a new technology, at least for the U.S. I think the technology actually came from France, but a technology of how to grind super fine flour came to Minnesota at this time, and then that flour is the desired flour by everybody in the United States. And so Minnesota, or Minneapolis, actually was the wheat flour capital of the world for 50 years. That means it produced more flour than anywhere else in the world for 50 years. This is a postcard, and on it said Pillsbury A Mill, the largest flour mill in the world. So this is the Pillsbury A Mill, and that is still standing today. This view, if you go across the river from this view, that's where now the Mill City Museum is located. So it's in that area of the Stone Arch Bridge. Back when the Stone Arch Bridge was there was still a rail line going across it. One of the reasons why Minneapolis was able to become the flour capital of the world was because there's a lot of wheat being grown in Minnesota on these bonanza farms. Bonanza Farms came about because the Northern Pacific Railroad was planning to put a railroad through Minnesota, and then it went bankrupt. And so it had all this land, and it had to satisfy its investors, and so it traded the bonds for land. So these Eastern investors all of a sudden had these huge tracts of very fertile land. They hired managers, local managers and farmers, and they started planting wheat because it was a crop that grew well. So this land was very fertile. It was in like the Red River Valley region of Minnesota. This is a quote from King Wheat. Oliver Dalrymple in 1875 broke 1,280 acres of Red River Valley land, and in 1876 harvested 32,000 bushels of excellent wheat, averaging almost 23 bushels to the acre. So the land was very productive, but they kept planting wheat on it year after year. They didn't do crop rotations back then, so the yields started to go down. They also had stem rust issues and locust issues, and by about 1920, the Bonanza Farms had gone bust. And then, of course, we know after 1920, it was the 1930s and the Dust Bowl happened. So, no mention of wheat in Minnesota is complete without talking about Norman Borlaug, who was a 1970 Nobel Prize winner, often referred to as the father of the Green Revolution. Borlaug was a plant breeder at the U of M that greatly increased wheat yields with the introduction of the dwarf wheat plant, which he's holding. So this dwarf wheat was different from the wheat that was being planted before it because it was much shorter. It was allocating more resources into the grains than the vegetation. So it had a greater yield, bigger seeds, and it was easier to harvest. This scientific discovery has helped reduce hunger throughout the world. And this photo is actually from a Life magazine cover. So now wheat is not as commonly planted, and of course we know that the main crop planted, although it's followed closely by soybeans in Minnesota, is corn. And corn might not seem very interesting. I mean, I grew up in northeastern South Dakota, so I've seen corn my whole life, and I'm like, corn's boring. But actually the history of corn is really fascinating. It was domesticated 10,000 years ago, so it's had a very long, close relationship with humans. And it was domesticated from teosinte grass, which is the seed head is shown right here. It hardly looks like nowadays corn at all, or the corn that's planted now. So the feat of breeding this teosinte grass into the corn that we see today, of course it was a very long process, but it's a really amazing thing that happened. And even breeders today, when they think about how ancient peoples figured out how to breed this into corn that looked similar to what we have today, they're still amazed that that feat happened. So it was essential to the major civilizations of the Americas. It was first domesticated in Central America, but tribes and civilizations from South America all the way to North America used it, and it's in the culture and in the myths of tribes across the Americas. So one of the reasons why corn has been able to be bred and stretched from phenotypically looks so different from its original ancestor is that corn has a very interesting genome. Corn responds really well to hybrid vigor than other plants, and maize individuals are much less alike at the genome level than other organisms, for example, people. So if you were to take two random people and hold their genome maps to each other, they would match at about 98%. So we're almost identical in terms of genomes. Corn, on the other hand, if you take from two different varieties and try to match the genomes, they're only alike at about 35%. This means that the corn genome holds a lot of variation, and and breeders can use that to breed different types of corn. 98%. So today, 41% of Minnesota cropland is corn, and Minnesota supplies 9% of the U.S. corn. I've got a trivia question for you. How many ears does one corn plant typically have? And when I say that, I mean field corn, like the dent that's grown in the big fields. What do you guys think?
12.
Don't look at these photos. This is wrong.
I would say 3.
Okay, so we got 2 and 3, and so it's actually on average it's 1. You
Oh.
will see corn plants that have 2, and those are often on the edges of fields. So corn and field corn is planted really close together, and so it allocates all of its like energy into one good ear.
Really?
But if they have a little more space, they might make 2 ears. So yeah, it's not intuitive, right? Like even in this photo, they show 3, 4, and 2. So there are trade-offs that come with having a very economically profitable plant. One of the trade-offs is that when corn prices were very high, I think it was about 6 years ago, maybe 7 now, farmers started plowing up native prairie and started putting land back into CRP because land that previously wasn't economically viable was when the prices were very high. And with any monoculture, as this photo exemplifies, you can see a problem. It's just the same plant over and over again. So like if you were a pollinator, you wouldn't have anywhere to stop. Maybe there's some flower in this ditch, maybe. But it makes for a different kind of landscape for native wildlife. Also, there's always the issue of management with any row crop or even feedlot. There's a nitrogen nutrient management issue. So the MCPA put out a report and found that 70% of nitrates come from row crop agriculture. So that's not just corn, row crops in general. And that 27% of lakes and rivers exceeded drinking water thresholds for nitrates. And we know when there's too much phosphorus or nitrogen in lakes and rivers, you can get eutrophication of lakes or algal blooms. So with all the 10 plants, we have to think of them not as good or bad, but as the trade-offs that we get with them. So moving on to soybeans. Soybeans arrived in Minnesota in 1902, and when they came, people didn't really see them as a food crop. They didn't in the U.S. they didn't understand. They heard that you could use them for soy sauce and this thing called tofu that's eaten elsewhere, but mostly they were used as an animal feed or a plowed down crop to put nitrogen back into the soil. Experimenters did start to take notice of them, but for the potential in the soybean oil. So by 1935, soy was involved in the manufacturing of every Ford motor car, in the paint, the shock absorber fluid, the plastic for gear shift knobs, etc. And the demand for oils, lubricants, and plastics increased during World War II. So as this demand increased, soybeans increased in popularity, of course, because the price increased for soybeans. So they started to be planted more and more, started to be researched more. And today, soybeans and soy oil is used in an incredible amount of products that you wouldn't even think. Like crayons are made from soy a lot of times. Today, soybeans is a very good crop for the state's economy. It brought in $3.25 billion in 2015. Minnesota is the U.S.'s 3rd largest soybean producer. So we got a question for you guys. Where do Minnesota soybeans go? Do they go to U.S. feedlots, to the many non-food items, to China via rail through Pacific Northwest, or to Europe and Russia?
Not all of the above, huh?
Oh, that's a tough one.
We got 4.
I'd say 2.
So close. They are exported, but they're exported to China. China purposely imports soybeans, and as such helps our balance of trade.
Huh.
So, yeah, most soybeans go to if they're being used in the U.S., most of them are being used for animal feed, but the majority from Minnesota go to China. Okay, so now we're moving on from the row crops to alfalfa, which is a forage crop. And alfalfa is interesting to the history of alfalfa. It was originally domesticated in modern day Iran, in the Middle Eastern area, and it was used as a forage crop way back then. And it spread with the Persian Empire. They used it for their cattle. And then later, with the Roman Empire, it was also used the Romans used it, and so it was spread once more geographically and got into Europe. And then finally, a German farmer named Wendelin Grimm brought alfalfa to Minnesota in the 1870s. And so Wendelin Grimm basically did some of his own plant breeding and planted these seeds he had brought from Germany, selected the plants that did the best, and kept doing that, and finally got this really great alfalfa strain. And he fed his dairy cattle on this forage crop and kept them nice and fat. And his neighbors would come by and be like, "What are you feeding your cows? They're always so fat. What grass are you feeding them?" And he'd say, "No, I'm not feeding them a grass, I'm feeding them everlasting clover." So word got around about this magical forage crop, and finally the Ag Experiment Station picked it up, started experimenting on it, and then made the seed commercially available. And so these pictures, this photo right here, shows the Grimm farmstead, which has been restored by Three Rivers Park. You can visit this park in Carver County near Victoria. The plaque on the stone right here is this stone and plaque is the same as this rock in this picture. I know it's hard to see, but this was the original dedication ceremony that happened June 10th, 1924. Today, it is estimated that Grimm's alfalfa is the basis for the U.S.'s third largest crop, which is hay, accounting for 60 million acres and a value of $3.4 billion. In Minnesota, however, only about 1 million acres are planted with alfalfa, much smaller than the roughly 7 million that corn and are planted into corn and soybeans. So although alfalfa is wonderful for building soil nitrogen, which I'm going to talk about, it's not always a big money maker for farmers. So alfalfa is a legume, and as we know, legumes are nitrogen fixers. And alfalfa is an especially good one because it has these extensive roots. They can get up to 9 feet long. So if you're doing the math, that's 68,900 miles of roots per acre, with roughly 53 pounds of nitrogen stored within the roots, within the biomass of the plant. And then
I used to rotate that.
of course, nitrogen fixation is important for sustainable farming. So if you were to plant a crop after having alfalfa in the soil for a couple years, this perennial crop, there would be a lot more organic matter, a lot more nitrogen there for the next crop, and you wouldn't have to use as much fertilizer. Alfalfa is also good for pollinators, for insects and spider species. There was a study done in California, and how many insects do you think they found in an alfalfa field? How many different species?
1,000.
Yes, 1,000. At the top.
$1,000 for $1,000.
I had a hard time getting rid of it in my yard, no wonder.
So this chart shows a comparison of the acres planted in Minnesota, the yield, the income, the revenue, cost of production, and the nitrogen in the soil afterwards. If you look at the acres, I threw some rough numbers out a couple slides ago. These are more specific. Corn, it's roughly 8.3 million acres of corn in Minnesota. There's 7 million in soybeans, 1.3 million in wheat. So wheat's, not as big as it used to be, but there's still quite a bit. And then only 900,000 in alfalfa. And of course, apple, we haven't talked about apple yet, but that's a totally different game. So there's a lot less acres in apple. Then if you look at the nitrogen loss, you can see there's quite a bit of nitrogen loss with corn. Soybeans, interestingly, even though they are a legume, there's still nitrogen loss from soybeans, and this is because they use a lot of the nitrogen that they fix. They put it back into the plant, they put it into the above ground biomass, and then that gets harvested, at the end of the year. So the nitrogen isn't making it back, the organic matter isn't making it back into the soil, it's not decomposing. And so But we have, for alfalfa, it just says high nitrogen increase. So it's not quantified, but it's definitely, there's a positive nitrogen increase after alfalfa. And weeds, of course, also you lose nitrogen with. But why is alfalfa not planted as much? You can see the per acre revenue is quite different. And actually, I don't know the exact methods they use to fix this, but I know alfalfa crops can also be, it can be tricky to get a good hay from them, and so you don't always even get this number, probably. So it's kind of a high risk crop.
Well, if it rains right after you cut it.
So,
Yeah.
this is a quote from John Foley, who's the former director of the Institute of the Environment at the U of M. And I'm not going to read it all, but just this last part is good to emphasize. Agriculture has been the single most powerful force unleashed on this planet since the end of the Ice Age, no question. But agriculture is not an option, it's a necessity. So agriculture is essential, we all need to eat, and the U.S. exports much of its agriculture production as well, so we, it's important for trade. But management is the key. Reducing inputs that harm the environment while increasing production to continue to meet human needs is a balance we must continually strive for. So moving on from the row crops and forage crops onto food crops, we're going to talk about the apple. And the apple, Minnesotans love apples. Apple was nominated by more of the public than any other plant. 54 people nominated the apple, and 29 people nominated Honeycrisp specifically. But you couldn't always grow apples in Minnesota. It used to have, the climate was too cold for the varieties that used to be around. And so for example, Horace Greeley, who wrote for the New York Tribune, said in 1860, "I could not live in Minnesota. There are no apples there." The reason why Minnesota has apples today is this guy, Peter Gideon. He was almost a little obsessive in his search for an apple that tasted good, that would grow in Minnesota. And he planted hundreds and hundreds of apple trees and worked on this, and finally found an apple that would grow here and that tasted good. And he named it the Wealthy Apple. And this was the first selection from Minnesota. He named it after his wife, whose first name was Wealthy, not because she was wealthy, but from there we have developed a breeding program and developed many more varieties. This picture here shows the historical plaque where Gideon's house used to be. Here, this is not his old house, it's not restored, that's just a different house, but this is the plaque where it used to be. And the Minnesota Horticultural Society lobbied the legislature to purchase farm adjacent to Peter Gideon's, which became the first horticulture research center. And so that has since moved to the Arboretum and is the Apple House in Orchard on Route 5 near Victoria. So, trivia question, how many apples has the U of M introduced?
28.
32.
28.
Hey.
Yeah.
You know, it was interesting. We drove, this is completely off topic, but my husband and I drove across the UP this early October. And it was amazing how many places there were little tiny orchards.
Yeah.
And so we started watching, and you could see the remnants of old homesteads. So wherever there was an apple tree, we started looking for other signs that there was human habitation.
There was human at one point.
At one point.
Yeah.
It was pretty cool.
So we're going to talk a little bit about how you get a selection, how you get a new cultivar, and it involves a lot of apple tasting. So how many apples do you think Dave Bedford, who's the head apple breeder, pictured here, how many does he taste in a typical day when it's apple tasting time?
500.
That is right. 500 apples.
I cheated. I heard him on the radio this fall.
Oh yeah, well, that's not cheating. It's just doing your research. So, and it's worse than that because they don't all taste good.
Yeah, that's what he was saying.
He's looking for a selection, so they're tasting apples that have never been tasted before and could taste awful. Yeah, so Jim Luby is here. He's another guy that works in the U of M apple breeding program. They're in charge of the program, and if you're an apple breeder, you really have to have a long-term plan. You have to have some patience, because the whole process goes like this. Roughly, I'll describe it. You plant seeds, you grow them in a greenhouse, and you get these saplings. And then to speed the whole thing up, you graft the saplings onto dwarf rootstock. So then they'll fruit probably somewhere between 3 to 7 years, depending on the varieties, depending on the rootstock. And you have all these apple trees. And then you have to do the tasting, and that's where you taste 500 apples per day. And out of all of those, only 10 to 15 would be selections. So only 10 to 15 would taste good. The rest of them are discarded. All right, and then those selections, once you have one, you're like, okay, this has potential. You have to test it for how well it stores, if it holds up to diseases, if there's a place in the market for it. So then there's years of testing after that. And on average, it's about 15 years for it to go, for you to find a selection and for it to get to the market. Yeah, and so out of 2,100 selections, only 28 released as a new variety. All right, so we're moving on to another iconic Minnesota plant, wild rice. Wild rice was nominated by 35 people as one of the 10 plants. Many people associate wild rice with Minnesota, and it became the state grain in 1977. Today, Minnesota produces more than half of the world's hand-harvested wild rice and is second in the nation in the production of cultivated wild rice. So it's native. It's a native plant that's native to lakes and wet areas in much of the northern part of Minnesota. Wild rice is an annual grass that stores well, and because it stores so well and it is highly nutritious, it was one of the reasons why humans originally settled in Minnesota. It was extremely important to the Native American tribes, and then when Europeans came, it was also important for them as a sustenance. So the practice of harvesting wild rice and preparing it for storage is complicated. It has many steps, and I think there was a talk today actually about that in the last session. I didn't get to make it to that talk, but I'm sure they went into much more detail than I'm going to go into. Just going to go over briefly. This is a painting of the original process of harvesting wild rice, and it's still done like this in many areas, where you are in a canoe, a non-motorized boat. That's important because if it's motorized, it can pull up the grass because it's an annual grass, so it doesn't have a good root system. So you need to be gentle with it. And then you have 1 or 2 people inside the canoe that have these sticks, or here they were using more like a paddle, that pull the long strands of wild rice over the boat, and you kind of tap it, and then all of the wild rice grains that are ready fall off into the boat. You have to do it numerous times because not all of the wild rice seeds get ready at the same time, so you have to go back out there. But it might seem like a lot of work, but it's a good sustainable way of farming because you're not harming the wild rice stands. And then it's not super efficient, so and that's a good thing because some of the seeds might fall back in the water, so you're ensuring that there's going to be wild rice there for the next year, or that there at least be seeds in the bank, in the seed bank at the bottom to grow again. This is another part of the process to prepare wild rice for storage. It's called winnowing, and what these ladies are doing is they're shaking the seeds and removing the chaff from the outside of the grain so that it's just that nice, smooth grain that you would get at the grocery store. The history of access to wild rice lakes and who gets to rice and who doesn't is very complicated and fraught. Currently, ricing is regulated by the DNR and reservation wild rice committees, and then wild rice lakes on reservations are managed by the reservation rice committees alone. Wild rice, I mentioned, it's extremely nutritious. It's interesting, it has a phytochemical called orazanol, which has a cholesterol lowering effect. And it has a very low glycemic index, which is good for diabetics. The Minnesota Cultivated Wild Rice Council has information on nutrition and recipes for using wild rice if you guys are interested. New research shows that this orazanol has the cholesterol lowering compounds needed. So it's delicious and it's also very good for you. All right, moving on to white pine, another native plant. White pine, the story of white pine is really a story that you can tell people or tell kids about wise resource use, because this resource was not used wisely. There used to be huge tracts of forests in Minnesota, especially white pine forests. It wasn't the only, they weren't like monocultures of white pine, but it was a dominant tree in a lot of the plant communities that grew back then. And people saw it as an inexhaustible resource, basically. It was, specifically the white pine was really in demand because of how easily it cut and because it produced these nice, long, large, knot-free boards. And it was needed, wood was needed. White pine really built the cities of the Midwest, Chicago and Minneapolis. And the fact that there was rivers that went right through the logging areas, and then later rail lines made harvest very easy. In the beginning, they would actually just cut these big logs and push them into the river and float them down to the next spot where they would get on a go devil and be taken down to a mill. This is when trains, rail lines started to be built. You can see how many logs they piled on. So this photo is from the Library of Congress, and it says, the caption here reads, 54 16-foot white pine logs were about as many as most loggers could get on a go devil. With Babe hitched to his special skid, Paul once piled on 93,312. This is a photo of a mural from that was painted in 1938 from Sabika High School, and this mural actually shows many of the 10 plants. But this is a photo of the logging that was happening, the white pine. And because this business was really booming, a lot of people came and found work logging, including numerous immigrants that were coming to Minnesota during that era. This is a photo of the large knot-free boards that I was talking about. And I got a question in the last session, how were they knot-free? Like, how did that happen? And one of the attendees to the session actually answered that, and she said, so you get knots if there's branches. And so in the old growth forest, white pine actually, it basically prunes itself and it loses its branches. So it's just this, because they're very close together, so it's these long, skinny trunks without branches. And so that's how you got these big knot-free boards. Of course, there came a time when people started to realize that the white pine forests were not inexhaustible, and by 1920 the yield of white pine was down to 576 million board feet per year, down from 2.3 billion during its heyday. So in the late 1800s and early 1900s, General Christopher C. Andrews spearheaded a movement to save the forest, and he really was essential in creating the two national forests that we have, the Chippewa and the Superior. Although these efforts influenced the sustainability of practices and preserved many trees, by 1990 still 90% of Minnesota white pine was gone. And so today logging practices are much different, and there's restoration underway of white pine, but it's not easy to replace the old growth pine forests. All right, so now we're going to talk about American elm. American elm was really America's favorite shade tree. People used to plant American elm for special occasions. Like if you got married, you would plant an American elm. If you had a baby, you would plant an American elm. In Minneapolis, on Memorial Drive, they planted elms for every person who died in World War I. So 568 trees were planted in memoriam. But also, and why were they planted so much? Well, people loved the shape of the tree, and they were also great for the environment around them. I'm going to read this quote for you, and it says, "The Hannah William elm on the Champney Estate in Deerfield is pictured here. The old tree fell in 1885, causing the owners to relocate the house to be near another tree." So that's how important American elms were to people back then. And there's a lot of reasons for this. American elms do a lot for the environment around them. They cool. In the summertime, they reduce water runoff. They provide a sound barrier. They purify the air and water. And then something more important to us today, they also sequester carbon dioxide in their biomass, so in the trees and in the trunks and in their limbs. A side note, they're also good for wildlife. The genus Ulmus, so not just the American elm, but the whole elm genus, supports 215 species of caterpillars, Lepidoptera, which are butterflies, and moths. So people loved this tree, and they planted it everywhere, and really set up the conditions that were perfect for a disease outbreak. And it came in the form of Dutch Elm Disease. So Dutch Elm Disease is a fungus. It entered the country in 1931, and it spread rapidly. Dutch Elm Disease spread through beetles, and it also could spread from tree to tree if the roots were grafted together. So for instance, when they planted elms and boulevards right next to each other and they got really big under the ground, those roots might touch at some point, and that contact was enough for fungus to travel through. So this is a picture of what a tree with Dutch elm disease looks like. The fungus creates these patterns in the spiders. Yeah, it looks creepy. 1 in 100,000 American elms is DED tolerant, so some did survive. Of course, also if they were far away from other elms, they might survive as well. Before DED, Minnesota had over 140 million elms. How many do you guys think are in Minneapolis, or were in Minneapolis in 1975? Does anyone want to guess?
100.
300,000. Today, how many do you think are left?
3,000.
50,000. So yeah, more than I would have thought, but still a drastic drop from 300,000. There's an interesting place in Minnesota. It's 150 acres just south of the town, Candy, Ohio. There stands an old-growth forest with all of the native species of upper Midwest elms. It has red elm, rock elm, and American elm. And there's little DED damage. And no one really knows why. Forestry experts cannot explain why this forest has resisted DED, but it has. And so it's just another wonder of plants and their complexity. American elms remain an important tree in Minnesota. We have learned an important lesson from the devastation of DED in the eastern U.S. And that lesson is that you should plant diversity, plant more diversity in your landscaping.
Then we went to hash.
So yeah, if you guys are interested, you can type in like Candy, Ojai, elm stand, and you might find that more information on the internet. It's interesting. All right, so moving on to lawns. Lawn/turf grass. So lawns weren't always a thing in the United States. We actually got the idea from the English. During the 1800s, English lawns became a huge thing, and the rich, wealthy class in the United States wanted to act rich and wealthy, and the closest thing they had to show them how to do that was the British aristocracy. And so we kind of copied them, but the thing is, England has a very conducive climate for lawns. It's cool, it's pretty mild. Well, the United States has a variable climate, right? So lawns don't always work as well in the US, although we want them to. You know, a lot of people want to have those greens, perfect lawns, even in the desert. During the Depression, lawns were scarce, of course, and then also during World War II, people were encouraged to plant victory gardens. During the war, there was a lot of research that was done on chemicals, and after the war, that research, the results of that research were fertilizers and pesticides that were available to the general public, and so these started to be marketed towards people that wanted to have a really nice, perfect lawn. And so lawn and turf grass is a big part of the economy. It's $10 billion economic impact in Minnesota. There's 54,000 jobs related to it, and 508,785 acres of green space in the state. So it has a bigger impact than you would immediately think in your head. Lawns do have benefits, and it's all about management, again, and thinking about the trade-offs. So with a lawn, you are preventing erosion, you're filtering contaminants, releasing oxygen, moderating air temp, reducing noise, sequestering carbon again, and then providing a great recreation space. But if you're putting a lot of inputs into your lawn and comparing them to the benefits, you might come out negative, depending just on how you manage it. One of the ways to have a more sustainable lawn is to put your lawn clippings back on your grass. And so how much nitrogen do you think is added per 1,000 square feet from lawn clippings? Does anyone want to guess? Throw a number out there. 1 pound.
1 pound.
Yes.
Okay,
So for every 1,000 square feet, a typical lawn will add 1 pound of nitrogen from the clippings during a growing season. So then, just wanted to show you some lawns that might not be perfect. This lawn, also this lawn, right? But we have this, a lot of people have this idea of they want a perfect lawn, they want a perfect landscape. And University Extension is doing a lot right now with pollinators. They have been doing the past year. And one of the things they're promoting is a healthy landscape instead of a perfect landscape. So what does a healthy landscape look like? Well, a healthy landscape has a diverse number of species. It has lower inputs than benefits, so you're getting a net benefit at the end to the environment. It improves the environment for wildlife, pollinators, and other species. And this can be, and it provides beauty. It can provide beauty to humans, especially if you're interested in attracting that wildlife. And then a healthy landscape is sustainable, so it's able to maintain the status or improve with time. So if we can maybe change our mindset a little bit, think about things in a different way, we could start thinking about healthy landscapes, healthy lawns, instead of that perfect landscape and perfect lawn. All right, so we came to the final plant, number 10, which is the only plant that was chosen purely for its negative impact on the state. But I mean, really, it's important. It was an important plant because it was the poster child for invasive plants, and it kind of taught the state of Minnesota a lot of lessons on how to deal with plants and how to think about plants, right? So purple loosestrife was not always an invasive plant. It was not always so well understood. Not so long ago, it was sold as an ornamental in nurseries. Today, of course, it's a noxious weed, and it's not legal to sell purple loosestrife. It took a while to get this plant under control, and one of the main and new controls that came along with it was this biological control of beetles. So purple loosestrife, the history of this plant is originally from Eurasia. It mostly likely arrived in the U.S. by a ship in the ballast. They used to use soil for ballast, and probably there were some seeds in there. But immigrants continued to bring it over because it actually has a lot of herbal uses. So in addition to being a pretty ornamental, immigrants brought it and used it to treat diarrhea, to treat dysentery, bleeding wounds, ulcers, and sores. It was also used as an astringent and an antibacterial. Unfortunately, the exotic purple loosestrife can hybridize with the native loosestrife, which increases its genetic diversity. And after that, it was a regular plant in the landscape. Garden centers were breeding these ornamentals that they thought were sterile. And so they were giving them out and saying, oh, they're sterile, they can't breed. But that actually turned out to be wrong. Purple loosestrife found a way around that. So more genetic diversity was added to the gene pool. And actually, it's interesting, purple loosestrife wasn't a problem for about 120 years. And then kind of a combination of factors, and it really just started to take off. One of the reasons maybe was when they were creating new roads, the disturbance helped spread purple loosestrife. So as soil disturbance increased, as more highways were built, the plant took over the drainage ditches. And then also it likes places where there's extra fertilizer and, of course, wetlands. Purple loosestrife has some characteristics that are just like set it up to be a very successful plant. Of course, when it came over, it had no natural enemies before they brought the beetles in to try to help control it. It has tiny seeds that are very easily spread. It has an extra long blooming season. It doesn't only spread by seeds, but it also spreads vegetatively. Estimates of the seed production for one plant range from just over 100,000 seeds to more than 2.5 million.
Per plant?
Per plant. Because it has it has a longer blooming season. Yeah. And then the seeds remain viable in the soil for up to 10 years. So if they don't get a chance this year, they got 9 more years to try. And it also grows in a variety of environments. So the DNR had to actually partner with numerous different agencies to get this plant under control. It partnered with the Department of Transportation, and they used a lot of different methods. They used mechanical methods to get rid of it, herbicides, but then really kind of what helped turn the tide was the biological control, which has been a success. These are photos from the Minnesota DNR website of the beetles. These little yellow things are the larvae, and it shows just how effective they can be in controlling the plant. So purple loosestrife really changed our view of plants. We know now that we need to act faster and understand the risks before we start introducing non-native ornamentals. And then also seek multiple controls if a plant does get out of control. So the infestation has been reduced but not eliminated. I don't think elimination is even necessarily the key. It's more about management. You probably will never eliminate it, but if you can get a balance, that's what's the most important. And then to end, purple loosestrife, we've talked about how bad it is for this whole section. It also has something good that comes from it. What sweet food comes from purple loosestrife? You guys want to guess? Sweet.
Is that honey?
Honey, yeah. So bees love it, and the honey that's made from it is delicious. So that's one positive thing you can say for it. So with that, I have a bunch of references up here. If anybody's interested in anything that we talked about, you can come talk to me after. And then that's the end of the presentation. So I hope that the 10 plants has helped you to appreciate the importance of plants in Minnesota, and that you will see these plants with new eyes. Do you guys have any questions? Got about 3 minutes.
So apples really weren't, I mean, the Wealthy was the first apple in the 1860s, 70s that was developed for Minnesota?
Yeah.
Interesting. And my grandparents farmed up by Freeport, which is, 20 miles up the road here. And they were newlyweds in 1916, and they planted an apple orchard as kind of a way to make extra money.
Oh, okay.
And that orchard was they tended that as tenderly as they tended their babies and their cows, because they got extra money from that orchard. It wasn't real big, But, and I remember asking my grandmother, I said, like, you're growing apples? And she said, yeah, we grew apples.
Wow, yeah.
So,
It's extra cash. Extra
yep,
cash.
that's where I learned that you never plant anything before Memorial Day. Because it can freeze before Memorial Day.
Yeah.
So they apparently had a bumper crop one year. They had just like all these fruits set. And you know, they had bloomed and they'd set fruit and everything. They were making their plans on what they were going to do with the money they were going to get from the apples. And they had an ice storm at the end of May.
Oh.
Lost them all.
It's tough to be any kind of farmer.
Yeah.
So Diane, I know, of course, the U has lots going on with apples down there.
Yeah.
What about like elms? Are they doing anything with elms and
That's a good question.
D&D resistance or hybrids?
I'm not sure if
along
he
the
was
lines?
doing stuff with elms, but I know that that is happening at I think at different universities because there is now varieties that they've started releasing of elms that they think are that should be resistant to Dutch Elm Disease. Yeah, I don't know about specific research at the U.
And any concern of like the mongoose syndrome with the beetles and purple loosestrife? Like once, you know, if they over control the loosestrife, do they start going after
Going
more
off somewhere
natives or
else.
anything?
Yeah, I think with any kind of biological control, they test it a lot now, like these days now. They test it a lot and they are as sure as possible before they release it. And actually insect herbivores, so insects that eat plants in general, don't switch from their host plant. We of course know about all the exceptions because they're the pests,
Right.
but those are the exceptions. Like if you think of the monarch butterfly, they can only use milkweed, right, during their larval
Yeah.
stage. So that's actually the case with most insects. But it's a living organism and microevolution happens, so I mean, I don't think you can guarantee it.
Life finds a way.
Life finds a way.
Jurassic Park, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Especially in a plant that produces 1,000,000 seeds per
Yeah.
plant.
Oh my gosh.
Thanks for all your videos.